than 300 Waukesha 310 diesel engines ever left the factory. That's not a production run. That's a rounding error. Today, collectors hunt for these things like buried treasure. Most never find one. So why would a company build so few of something farmers actually needed? Waukesha, Wisconsin. 1906. A small machine shop opens its doors with exactly 12 employees and a simple idea: build engines that don't quit. Nobody could have predicted what that little operation would become. The Waukesha Motor Company didn't just build engines, they built reputations. Within 2 decades, their name became synonymous with the kind of reliability that people bet their livelihoods on. Oil field operators in Texas ran Waukesha engines around the clock, or pumping crude out of the ground in conditions that would destroy lesser machinery. Mining operations in Colorado trusted them to keep air flowing into shafts hundreds of feet underground. When the engine failing meant men dying, they called Waukesha. Then World War II happened. Suddenly the military needed engines, lots of them. Landing craft needed power plants that could take salt water, sand, and enemy fire without complaint. Waukesha delivered. By the time the boys came home, the company had built over 1 million engines. 1 million! That's not a typo. Their reputation wasn't just good anymore, it was bulletproof. Now here's where American farming enters the picture. The 1950s were transforming everything about agriculture. Diesel power was sweeping across the heartland like a slow-moving storm. Farmers who'd spent decades wrestling with gasoline tractors were discovering something remarkable. Diesel engines ran longer. They burned cheaper fuel. They produced more torque exactly when you needed it, pulling a plow through heavy clay or hauling a loaded wagon up a hill. Every major tractor manufacturer was scrambling to catch up. International Harvester had diesel options. John Deere was pushing hard, and Oliver Corporation, based in Charles City, Iowa, found themselves at a crossroads. They needed a competitive edge, not just another diesel, something special, something that would make farmers sit up and pay attention. So Oliver came knocking on Waukesha's door. The engine company saw opportunity, a chance to dominate a market they'd never really touched: agricultural equipment. Millions of tractors rolling across American fields, all needing power. The partnership made sense on paper. Waukesha's industrial expertise combined with Oliver's farming pedigree. They had no idea what they were getting into. Oliver needed something special. What they got was an engineering marvel that would become an engineering orphan. The late 1950s hit Oliver like a freight train they didn't see coming. And the train had John Deere painted on the side. Here's what was happening. American farms were getting bigger, fast. The small family operations that had defined agriculture for generations were consolidating into larger commercial enterprises. A farmer who worked 200 acres in 1950 was suddenly looking at 500 acres by 1958, maybe more. And those bigger operations needed bigger equipment, more power, more efficiency, more everything. John Deere understood this. International Harvester understood this. They were rolling out diesel tractors that made farmers stop and stare. The John Deere Model 730 diesel was a beast. It delivered genuine pulling power that gasoline engines simply couldn't match. And farmers were doing the math on fuel costs. Diesel burned slower. Diesel cost less per gallon. Diesel engines lasted longer because they ran at lower temperatures and higher efficiency. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Oliver's numbers were impossible to ignore too, just not in a good way. Sales dropped 15% in 2 years. 15%. In an industry where you fight for every single point of market share, that's not a decline. That's a collapse in slow motion. Oliver's dealers were calling headquarters with the same message over and over. Farmers are asking for diesel. We don't have diesel. They're walking across the street to John Deere. The thing is, Oliver wasn't stupid. They knew diesel was the future. Everyone knew diesel was the future. The problem was getting there. Oliver had gasoline engines that worked fine. They were reliable, well understood, and fit perfectly into their existing tractor designs. The Super 88 and Super 99 models were good tractors. Farmers liked them. But liking wasn't enough anymore. Farmers needed power, and they needed it economically. A gasoline tractor burning fuel at twice the rate of a diesel competitor was a losing proposition, no matter how reliable it was. So why not just drop a diesel engine into the existing tractors? That's what everyone assumes. Just swap the engine. How hard could it be? Very hard, actually. Oliver's tractor frames had specific dimensions, specific mounting points, specific weight distributions, the hood line, the front axle positioning, the transmission tunnel, all of it designed around their existing gasoline engines. You couldn't just grab any diesel off the shelf and bolt it in. Diesel engines were heavier. They ran at different speeds. They had different torque curves. They needed different cooling systems. Everything had to match, and nothing matched. The company faced a choice. A complete redesign of their tractor line would take years and cost millions. Millions they didn't have, not with sales sliding and dealers getting nervous. But doing nothing meant watching John Deere and International Harvester eat their market share piece by piece until there was nothing left. Most companies in this situation would have taken the safe route. License an existing diesel design from someone who already had one. Pay the royalties. Accept the compromise. At least you'd have something to sell. Oliver didn't do that. Instead, they went to Waukesha. Waukesha Motor Company had been building industrial engines since 1906. 50 years of experience. They knew diesels. They knew unconventional solutions. And they were willing to listen to a challenge that would have made most engine manufacturers shake their heads and walk away. Oliver's requirements were essentially impossible. They needed a diesel engine that could produce competitive horsepower. It had to fit within the dimensional constraints of their existing tractor designs. It needed to be affordable enough that they could actually sell the tractors at a reasonable price. And it had to work reliably in the field, because farmers don't have patience for engines that break down during harvest. Oh, and they needed it soon. Not in 5 years, not in 3 years. Soon. Waukesha's engineers looked at that list of requirements and saw something interesting, not a problem to be solved by conventional means. A challenge that would require rethinking what a diesel engine could be. They started sketching ideas that nobody in the agricultural industry had seriously considered before. What they came up with would become one of the rarest engines ever put into a farm tractor. It would also become one of the most difficult to maintain, most expensive to repair, and most sought after by collectors decades later. Waukesha didn't design a conventional diesel. They designed something that existed in a category all its own. So, let's get under the hood. Because the Waukesha 310 wasn't just another diesel, it was an engineering statement. The name tells you the first thing you need to know. 310 cubic inches of displacement. That's about 5.1 liters, for those keeping track in metric. 4 cylinders. Vertical inline configuration, nothing exotic about the basic layout. But that's where the conventional thinking ended. At the drawbar, you were looking at around 65 horsepower. Now, that might not sound earth-shattering today. Your riding mower probably makes half that. But in the context of 1950s agricultural equipment, 65 horsepower from a diesel that size was serious capability. This wasn't a small garden tractor. This was a machine built to work serious acreage day after day. The thing is, Waukesha didn't just want adequate performance. They wanted exceptional performance. And that meant pushing every parameter they could push. Start with the compression ratio, 17:1. Let that sink in for a second. Most farm diesels of that era were running around 15:1. Some of the more conservative designs were down at 14:1. Waukesha looked at those numbers and said, "No, we're going higher. That 2-point difference doesn't sound like much. Trust me, it is. Higher compression means more thermal efficiency, more complete combustion, More power extracted from every drop of fuel. In theory, you're getting something for nothing. The engine breathes the same air, burns similar fuel, but squeezes more work out of each cycle. In practice, you're building a machine that operates closer to its own limits every single time it fires. The fuel injection system was where Waukesha really showed what they could do. This wasn't some crude splash-and-hope arrangement. The 310 used a precision injection system that was genuinely advanced for agricultural applications. Individual pumps for each cylinder, carefully calibrated timing. The kind of engineering you'd expect to find in marine applications or industrial power plants, not something sitting in a cornfield. The injectors themselves operated at pressures that demanded precision manufacturing. We're talking about atomizing diesel fuel into a mist fine enough to burn completely in the compressed air charge. Get that wrong and you lose power. Get it really wrong and you damage the engine. Waukesha got it right, most of the time. Here's where it gets interesting. That high compression ratio created a problem. The engine demanded premium diesel fuel, not the stuff you could get at any rural filling station, the good stuff. Properly refined, low impurity count, consistent quality batch to batch. In the industrial world, that's not a big ask. Factories control their supply chains. Marine operators spec their fuel carefully. But American farmers in the 1950s? They bought fuel from whoever was convenient, whatever the local supplier had in the tank that week. Quality varied, sometimes dramatically. The 310 felt those variations immediately. Lesser fuels meant harder starting, rougher running, more carbon buildup. Accelerated wear on components that were already operating at tight tolerances. The engine wasn't being temperamental. It was being honest about what it needed. The cooling system deserves attention, too. Agricultural equipment faces thermal challenges that stationary engines never see. You're running hard during planting season, then sitting idle, then running hard again during harvest. Hot days, cold nights, dust getting into everything. The 310's cooling system had to handle all of that while maintaining the tight temperature control that high compression operation demanded. Waukesha used a design that prioritized consistent operating temperature over simple heat rejection. The system ran slightly hotter than some competitors, but it ran the same hot whether you were idling or pulling hard. That thermal stability mattered for the precision components inside. Every design choice reflected this philosophy. Push the envelope. Extract maximum performance. Accept no compromises on capability. The cylinder sleeves were wet type, meaning coolant touched them directly, more efficient heat transfer, also more complex manufacturing, more potential leak points, more things that could go wrong if maintenance slipped. The valve train was built for durability at sustained high loads, heavy-duty push rods, robust rocker arms, adjustment procedures that required precision and patience. Set them wrong and you'd know it. The engine would tell you with noise and lost power. The crankshaft rode on bearings that demanded clean oil at the right viscosity. And the oil pump moved enough volume to keep everything lubricated even during extended full-power operation. But that same system couldn't tolerate contamination. A farmer who stretched oil change intervals or let dirt get into the crankcase was writing a check his engine would eventually cash. On paper, the Waukesha 310 was everything Oliver wanted. Advanced technology, competitive power output, efficiency numbers that looked great in the marketing materials, a diesel engine that could go head-to-head with anything in its class. In the field, things got complicated fast. So here's where the dream met reality. And reality, as it usually does, won. The Waukesha 310 was supposed to revolutionize agricultural diesel power. What it actually did was nearly bankrupt everyone involved in making it. The problem wasn't that the engine didn't work. It worked beautifully. The problem was that beautiful engineering and profitable manufacturing are often two completely different things. Let's talk about where these engines actually ended up. The primary home for the Waukesha 310 was the Oliver Super 99 GM diesel tractor. Now, Oliver was betting big on this partnership. They wanted a diesel that would put them ahead of everyone else in the premium tractor market. John Deere had their diesels. International Harvester had theirs. Oliver figured the Waukesha 310 would be their secret weapon. The engine that would make farmers say, "I don't care what it costs, I want that one." And some farmers did say exactly that, but not enough of them. Production ran from roughly 1955 to 1957. That's it, a 2-year window, maybe a bit longer if you count the stragglers, but the main production run was incredibly brief. And during that window, Waukesha's factory in Wisconsin was churning out these engines at a pace that would make any accountant weep. Here's the thing about the 310. Each one required nearly 40% more machining time than comparable diesel engines on the market. 40%. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between making money and losing your shirt. The fuel injection pump alone tells you everything you need to know about why this engine was a manufacturing nightmare. The tolerances were measured in 10,000ths of an inch. For context, a human hair is about 3,000ths of an inch thick. These pumps needed to be accurate to less than a tenth of that. Yes, every single time, on every single engine. At peak production, Waukesha's factory could only produce around 8 to 10 units per week. That's not per day, per week. Meanwhile, their competitors were stamping out simpler diesel designs by the dozens daily. The math just didn't work. The accountants were not pleased. Actually, that's putting it mildly. Waukesha was losing money on every single engine that rolled off the line. The more they built, the more they lost. It's the kind of business model that makes bankers start drinking before noon. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on your perspective. Oliver's dealer network was completely unprepared for what landed in their service bays. These weren't your grandfather's simple farm engines you could fix with a hammer and some creative cursing. The Waukesha 310 required specialized knowledge, specialized tools, and specialized parts that didn't exist in most small-town dealerships. Warranty claims started rolling in. Then they started flooding in. Dealers were sending angry letters to Oliver's headquarters, demanding to know why they were expected to service an engine that required a mechanical engineering degree to understand. One documented complaint mentioned that a dealer had to send an engine back to the factory 3 times for issues that should have been simple fixes. 3 times. For one engine. The shipping costs alone were eating into any profit margin that might have existed. And here's the real kicker. While Waukesha and Oliver were struggling to make the 310 work, their competitors weren't sitting still. During that same 1955 to 57 window, other manufacturers released simpler, cheaper diesel alternatives, engines that maybe didn't have the same sophisticated engineering, engines that maybe didn't produce quite the same quality of power, but engines that dealers could actually service, engines that factories could actually build profitably, engines that farmers could actually afford. The market made its choice. It usually does. Some historians estimate that total production of the Waukesha 310 for agricultural applications numbered somewhere between 300 and 500 units. The exact figure is disputed because record-keeping from that era wasn't exactly comprehensive. But everyone agrees on one thing: it wasn't many. By 1958, the writing was on the wall. But the story of the Waukesha 310 was far from over. If you're enjoying this deep dive into agricultural engineering history, hit subscribe. We cover forgotten machines like this every week. All right, back to the fields. So the Waukesha 310 rolled off the production line. Farmers bought their Oliver tractors. And then the real education began. Here's the thing about these engines. When they ran right, they were something special. Farmers who figured them out talked about pulling power that made other tractors look underpowered. The torque curve on these things was flat and wide. You could lug them down to speeds that would stall a gasoline engine, and they'd just keep pulling. One Iowa corn farmer described it as hooking a locomotive to his plow. That's not an exaggeration. On the diesel combustion characteristics combined with that specific bore and stroke ratio produced low-end grunt that astonished operators. But getting them to run right? That was the problem. The fuel injection system was the main culprit. Waukesha's injectors required precise calibration. We're talking tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The injection timing had to be perfect, the fuel pressure had to be exact, and the fuel itself had to be clean, not just filtered clean, absolutely pristine. Any contamination, any water, any particles too small to see with the naked eye, and those injectors would start causing problems. Farmers in the 1950s weren't used to this. They'd been running gasoline tractors that would burn just about anything. Diesel was different. And the Waukesha 310 was particularly unforgiving about it. One speck of dirt in the wrong place and you'd get uneven fuel delivery. That meant rough running. That meant power loss. That meant frustrated operators who started wondering why they'd spent extra money on this fancy diesel engine. The break-in procedure made things worse. Waukesha specified a careful break-in period, specific load limits for the first 50 hours, gradual increases after that, proper oil changes at exact intervals. Most farmers ignored this. They had fields to plow and crops to plant. They ran these engines hard from day one. The ones who did that usually regretted it. Premature wear patterns would develop. The injection pump would start acting up. And suddenly, that expensive diesel tractor was spending more time in the shop than in the field. Rural mechanics made the situation even more complicated. Most of them had never seen a Waukesha diesel before. They didn't have the specialized tools. They didn't have the service manuals. They didn't have the training. When a farmer brought in a 310 with injection problems, a lot of mechanics simply refused the job. They'd tell the farmer to take it to a dealer. Problem was, Waukesha dealers were few and far between. This created a strange phenomenon. A small community of Waukesha specialists emerged. These were mechanics who'd taken the time to learn these engines inside and out. Some of them had worked at Waukesha facilities before moving to rural areas. Others just had an aptitude for the technology and taught themselves. They became the guys you called when your 310 acted up. One Nebraska farmer tells the story of running his Waukesha 310 for over 12,000 hours before needing the first major overhaul. 12,000 hours. That's years of continuous operation. His secret wasn't complicated, but it required commitment. He drove 40 miles each way to a Waukesha certified mechanic for every single service. Oil changes, filter replacements, injection adjustments. 40 miles there, 40 miles back. Every time. Most farmers weren't willing to do that. They'd use whoever was closest. They'd skip services. They'd try to save money on parts, and their engines suffered for it. But here's what's interesting. The 310s that survived proper break-in, that got maintained correctly, that were operated by farmers who understood what they had, these engines became remarkably durable. Like almost legendary among the people who knew them. The metallurgy was excellent. The basic engineering was sound. The problems weren't inherent flaws in the design. They were tolerance issues, maintenance issues, operator issues. One mechanic from Wisconsin who serviced these engines for decades put it simply. He said the Waukesha 310 was a good engine that needed a great owner. Give it that, and it would outlast the tractor. Give it less, and you'd be buying a new engine before the tractor was paid off. The reputation split accordingly. Some farmers cursed the day they bought an Oliver with a Waukesha diesel. Others swore they'd never go back to gasoline. Same engine, completely different experiences. It all came down to how you treated it. The production line shut down, but the Waukesha 310s that survived kept working. And then they started disappearing. So here's where the story gets interesting for anyone watching this who might have an old Oliver sitting in a barn somewhere. The Waukesha 310 failed. We've established that. Commercially, it was a disaster. Waukesha lost money. Oliver lost money. Farmers who bought them often regretted it. By the mid-1960s, these engines were being pulled out of tractors and replaced with more conventional power plants. The Waukesha 310 looked like it was headed for the scrap heap of history. And then something happened. Time passed. The farmers who cursed these engines retired or passed away. Their kids inherited equipment they didn't want. Old Olivers with weird diesel engines sat in fence rows and barns, slowly rusting, slowly being forgotten. For decades, you could find a Super 99 GM with a Waukesha 310 for a few $100s, sometimes less. Sometimes people just wanted them hauled away. That's not the case anymore. Today, collectors estimate that fewer than 150 Waukesha 310 engines remain in operational condition, out of less than 1,000 ever built. That's maybe 15% survival rate, and honestly, that number might be optimistic. Some of those 150 are in museums. Some are in private collections. Some are still sitting in tractors that haven't run in 40 years, waiting for someone with enough patience and money to bring them back. And the money part has changed dramatically. In 2019, a fully restored Oliver Super 99 GM, with its original Waukesha 310 diesel, sold at auction for $38,000. The engine alone was valued at over $12,000. Think about that. An engine that Waukesha couldn't give away in 1957 is now worth more than most used cars. 10 years before that auction, the same tractor might have sold for $2,000 or $3,000, maybe less, if it needed work. The value trajectory has been steep, and it's not slowing down. Here's why. Rarity drives collector markets, obviously, but it's not just that these engines are rare, it's that they represent something specific. A moment in agricultural history when American manufacturers took genuine engineering risks, when they tried to solve real problems with innovative solutions, even if those solutions didn't quite work out. The Waukesha 310 is a physical artifact of that ambition. Also, they're genuinely interesting engines. Collectors who appreciate mechanical complexity love the 310, the pre-chamber combustion system, the unusual fuel injection setup, the specific sound they make when running. These engines have personality in a way that conventional diesels don't. But owning one comes with challenges that would make most people walk away. Parts availability is essentially non-existent. Waukesha stopped supporting these engines decades ago. Oliver's gone. The original suppliers are gone. If you need a fuel injection pump for a Waukesha 310, you can't order one. You find a core and rebuild it yourself, or you find someone who can. If you need pistons, you're either finding new old stock that's been sitting in a warehouse for 60 years, or you're having them custom made. Cylinder liners, bearings, gaskets, seals. Every single component is a scavenger hunt. The pre-chamber assemblies, those machined combustion chambers that make the 310 work, good luck. If yours are damaged, you're either finding a parts engine or paying a machine shop a small fortune to fabricate replacements. One collector I read about spent 3 years just sourcing parts for a complete rebuild. 3 years. And he considered himself lucky because he found a second engine he could use as a donor. This is where the community becomes essential. There's a dedicated group of Waukesha 310 enthusiasts, mostly connected through online forums and vintage tractor shows. These people share information obsessively: service tips, part sources, machinist contacts, tricks for keeping these engines running that never appeared in any manual. They photograph their rebuilds step by step and post the pictures for others to learn from. Without this community, restoring a Waukesha 310 would be nearly impossible. The factory documentation is incomplete. The original engineers are gone. The institutional knowledge died with Waukesha's diesel program. What survives exists in the memories of old-timers and the shared notes of collectors. Some of the best preserved examples live in agricultural museums now. The Floyd County Historical Museum in Iowa has one. A few private collections in the Midwest have running examples that appear at vintage tractor shows. When one of these tractors fires up and starts running, people gather around. They record video. The sound of a working Waukesha 310 is rare enough that it's worth documenting. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. Here's the thing that collectors understand. Every year, the number of surviving engines gets smaller. Cores get scrapped when people don't recognize what they have. Barn fires claim machines that sat for decades. Parts engines get stripped, and the remains disappear. The window for preserving these engines is closing. So if your grandfather had an Oliver with the Waukesha diesel, and you still have it somewhere on the property, you might be sitting on serious money. More importantly, you might be sitting on a piece of American engineering history that's worth preserving regardless of its monetary value. The Waukesha 310 failed as a commercial product, but as a piece of engineering history, it succeeded beyond anything its creators imagined. The Waukesha Motor Company kept building engines after the 310 experiment ended. They pivoted back to what they knew best: industrial applications, stationary power, the stuff that had built their reputation in the first place. But the agricultural diesel division, that became a footnote. A single chapter in a much longer company history that most people would never read. In 1973, Dresser Industries absorbed Waukesha. The brand still exists today, actually. They're making natural gas engines for industrial applications. Good ones, by all accounts. But if you walk into their modern facilities and ask about the 310 diesel, you'll probably get blank stares. It's not part of the corporate memory anymore, just another discontinued product from a different era. Here's what makes the 310 story worth telling, though. It's not just about a rare engine, it's about a pattern that repeats across every industry in every generation. The Waukesha 310 represents innovation that arrived at exactly the wrong moment. The engineers weren't wrong about diesel power for agriculture, they were absolutely right. Diesel would eventually dominate farm equipment. Every major manufacturer would switch over. The future that Waukesha was building toward actually happened. They were just 15 years too early. And that's a particular kind of tragedy in engineering. Being right at the wrong time is almost worse than being wrong, because you can see the validation coming. You can watch other companies implement the ideas you pioneered. You just can't benefit from it because the market wasn't ready when you showed up. This pattern shows up everywhere. Look at electric vehicles in the 1990s. The technology worked, the engineering was sound, but the infrastructure wasn't there. The battery costs were too high, and consumers weren't ready. Companies that tried to push electric cars in that era mostly failed. 20 years later, the same basic concept became a trillion-dollar industry, or consider early smartphones before the iPhone. There were devices with touchscreens and internet connectivity years before 2007. Palm was making sophisticated handheld computers. BlackBerry had mobile email figured out, but the pieces hadn't come together yet. And the cellular networks weren't fast enough. The screens weren't responsive enough. The app ecosystems didn't exist. The Waukesha 310 fits that same mold. Engineering excellence doesn't guarantee market success. It never has. The best product doesn't always win. Sometimes the best product comes too early, and by the time the market catches up, someone else has claimed the territory. There is another lesson here that modern manufacturers might want to remember. The 310 failed partly because of its dealer network problem. You can build the finest engine in the world, but if farmers can't get it serviced within 50 miles of their property, it might as well not exist. Serviceability matters, distribution matters, support infrastructure matters. Tesla learned this when they started building out their supercharger network. They understood that the product was only part of the equation. The preservation efforts around surviving 310s have intensified over the past decade. Collectors who own these engines treat them like museum pieces now. Every surviving example gets documented, photographed, studied. Parts get carefully cataloged. Operating procedures get recorded before the last people who remember them are gone. There's something important about that work. Keeping mechanical heritage alive isn't just nostalgia. It's preserving knowledge. The men who designed the 310 solved problems that engineers still face today. Their solutions were elegant, practical, ahead of their time. Losing that engineering DNA would be a genuine loss. Every industry has its Waukesha 310, the product that was technically brilliant but commercially doomed. The project that proved a concept but couldn't survive market reality. The engineers weren't wrong. The timing was. So what's the final verdict on the rarest agricultural engine ever built? So that's the story of the Waukesha 310 diesel. An engine that shouldn't exist. An engine that almost didn't exist, built by a company that had no business making agricultural diesels, installed in tractors from a manufacturer desperate to compete, produced in numbers so small that most dealers never even saw one. Fewer than 300. Maybe fewer than 200. Nobody knows for sure because the records are gone, the factories are gone, and most of the people who built them are gone too. But here's the thing. The engines aren't all gone. Somewhere right now, probably in a barn in Iowa or Nebraska or maybe Saskatchewan, there's a Waukesha 310 sitting under a tarp. Maybe the current owner knows what they have. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's been there since Grandpa parked it in 1958 and nobody's touched it since. That's not just scrap metal under that tarp. That's not just an old tractor engine. That's a piece of American agricultural history that most people don't even know existed. A diesel engine from an era when diesel in farm equipment was still an experiment, a partnership between two companies that were both trying to survive in a market that was eating them alive. The collectors who chase these engines, the restorers who spend years tracking down parts that haven't been manufactured in 6 decades, the old-timers who remember what that 6-cylinder sounded like at full load, they're keeping something alive that the industry forgot. If you've ever seen a Waukesha 310 in person, or if your family ran one of these Olivers back in the day, drop it in the comments. I want to hear about it. And if you want more stories about the machines everyone else forgot, the engineering that history overlooked, subscribe. We do this every week.